Hi everyone, Aaron here for Zollotech, and iOS 17 has been out for a little while now, and I wanted to share some battery tips that Apple actually says will save you some power and some things that we've learned along the way. So these iOS 17 battery tips definitely seem to benefit you over time if you actually disable some of these things. I'm not a big advocate for disabling any features, especially when you bought a new phone and you have all of these new features, but if things are there that you're not actually going to use, well, there's definitely some refinement that can be done. Now, the first thing is the latest iPhones, to help you save battery health over time, 15, 15 Plus, 15 Pro, and 15 Pro Max have a new option for battery health. And if we go into settings and we go down to battery, under battery health and charging, we have the option for charging optimization. Under charging optimization, we can turn on an 80% limit. Now, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this for everyone, but if you're trying to save your battery health over the period of maybe 3 or 4 years, and you don't have the budget to actually replace the battery, and you don't need that extra 20%, I would enable this because optimized battery really is charging between about 10 and 80% or 20 and 80%. However, I don't think it's worth your time to try and manage it, but now it will manage it for you. But if you plan to use your battery a lot, you find that you use most of your battery throughout the day, I would leave it on optimize and let iOS handle it for you. So that's what I would recommend. Typically, if you need to squeak out that little bit of extra battery health over a year or two, turn on 80%. It's yet to be seen what the actual benefit is over time, though. Now, widgets are something that got enhanced this year, not just with regular updates, but also with controls. So you'll see here we have some controls where we can play. We can go and see maybe the status of our car, and some of these can actually use a lot of power. Location-based ones in particular, or just widgets in general. If you remove widgets, people generally say that they benefit from actually better battery. The reason is anytime you go and unlock your screen, if we have the weather widget here, it will go and get that information and then update on a regular interval that they actually decide. So you'll see the current weather, it updates it, then updates the widget. So that's something you could benefit from removing. The same is true with location-based widgets. If it's something that actually has to check your location every time, I would highly recommend you either disable the option for that widget to check your location or just remove the widget altogether. The same is true on the lock screen. So let me get rid of these notifications here, and you'll see that I have one that actually shows when sunset is, and then also my battery status. Anytime I show my lock screen, it's going to pull that battery status from my AirPods case, so it's going to use more power. It's actually better if you go in and customize this, and as much as I like these features, if you really want to optimize your battery, get rid of those widgets, you'll save that little bit of extra power. Again, you can use widgets, but you may want to limit it to ones that don't use your location or deny access to your location. For example, this one in particular is using my current location. You can see that with the icon in the upper left. You can instead not use that at all and just use the one that's next to it that updates based on where you are that you've set, not necessarily where you are at all times. One thing that's great with iOS 17 but can also use a lot of power is live activities. Now, a lot of us appreciate things in the dynamic island, such as playing music. Swipe home, it goes to the dynamic island. If we go to our lock screen here, we've also got that playing here as well. This can actually use a lot of power, specifically if you're using location-based live activities. So maybe you're using an app that tracks flights and it's showing it all the time, or maybe you're just using Uber and you're seeing when someone will arrive. If you don't want it to actually track that, you can turn that off to save some additional power so it doesn't use information, whether that be data or just keep your screen on and let you know. This can be found under settings, then go down to Face ID and passcode. And if we scroll down, you'll see live activities and all of the other things that can actually show or allow access when locked on your lock screen. So you'll see here we have Siri and reply with messages and everything else. If you don't want those to show on your lock screen, disable these based on how you want it customized. Typically, you're not going to use a live activity unless you're looking at your phone, so you may save some additional power if you just unlock your phone and look at the home screen and take a look at the live activity by going to your notifications. That may save you some additional power, but again, customize this based on what you actually want within Face ID and passcode. One feature I really like is the new AirDrop feature, where you can bring two phones together and actually send a file. So for example, this wallpaper, which I'll link in the description, bring two phones together, it automatically airdrops them. However, this can use additional power by keeping sensors active when you bring things nearby, and also waking everything up so it can send that information back and forth. I've actually found this is more of a problem if you have multiple phones nearby, and if this is a problem or something you'll just never use, just go into your settings and disable it. Under General, go to AirDrop. Under AirDrop, turn off bringing devices together, and that will stop immediately. Now, if I bring these phones together, nothing will happen, and it's actually not even using the sensor or looking for it to figure out if it's there. If you're going to use it, it's really nice to have, but you could always turn it on as needed or just AirDrop the traditional way. Now, something that's really nice that's been in iOS for a little while is the haptic keyboard. With the introduction of iOS 16, Apple added that. However, that does use additional power every time you're typing because you've got the Taptic engine, which is in the phone, and it's moving every time you're typing using some additional power. Now, it may be a minute amount of power, but if you want to squeak every little last bit out, go ahead and disable it. That's under Settings, Sound and Haptics, then go down to Keyboard Feedback, and under Keyboard Feedback, turn off Haptic. That will save that a little additional power. I actually like it enough that I leave it on, but again, if you want that extra power, you can turn it off. And the same is true for a new feature with voicemail. Live voicemail was added with iOS 17, so when someone is calling, it transcribes what they're saying in real time. But if someone calls you and it goes into voicemail by itself, it will actually begin to live transcribe that on your display in real time. So you'll see it says waiting, and we're waiting for it, and now it's actually saying that I'm leaving a message, and we can tap to view. This will wake up your screen every single time someone tries to call you, so you may want to disable this. And you can actually see that it transcribed what I said, and the call is still going on live. So this is something, again, that you may want to disable. And to do that, go into your settings, go down to phone, scroll down, and you'll see an option for live voicemail. You can disable this if you'd like. Otherwise, just leave it on if you want to see what someone's saying. Maybe you have it plugged in throughout the day. It wouldn't be a big deal. But if you're someone that receives a lot of voicemail, this could use a lot of power if it just keeps lighting up your display, letting you know that someone's actually calling and then transcribing what they're saying. The next tip has to do with location. This is something we've talked about before many times. And if you go into your settings, go down to privacy and security, go to location services. Location services are crucial to certain things that you're doing. Whether you're using maps, it needs to know where your location is so it can give you that information, but not everything needs to have that location. So I would recommend going down and customizing this. I typically change it to while using so that it's not using it until I want it to. However, if you go under system services, you're going to see things that are using it regularly. I typically don't recommend turning off many of these things as your phone uses them for many of the services that it actually uses for different features, such as significant locations. But you can turn those off, and you may want to turn off the product improvement ones. I typically disable those, so even though improved maps was on, routing and traffic, things like that, I enjoy having those features, but if you don't want to send that information all the time and you think it's using a lot of power, you may want to disable that. But I would go through and customize this one by one and figure out what you want and don't want to actually use your actual location all the time. And you'll see under weather, we can change this to never or ask the next time it starts or just while using the app. Right now, we're allowing the widgets to use it, like I mentioned before. So you can fully customize this for every single app. You can turn it off altogether, but I wouldn't recommend doing that as most of your features won't work. Also, to go along with this is sharing your location. If you're using Find My iPhone or Find My Friends, and you're sharing your location with a family member or a significant other, that's something that you may want to customize. I actually share my location with my entire family, and because of that, I leave that on. But that will use a lot of power, especially if they're going into Find My to see where you are. That will turn on your GPS antenna to let you know where they are. And to go along with location, one thing I would highly recommend using if you use Maps a lot is a new feature that was added in iOS 17. Go into Maps, you'll see there's a new option for offline maps. Go into offline maps, and within offline maps, you can download an entire area of someplace you might be in regularly or someplace you're traveling to. This will stop it from actually pulling that data from your carrier while you're driving maybe, and just have the entire map available. So maybe we want to download a new map. You'll see we can jump to our current location, maybe a different country, or maybe a national park, or maybe somewhere else nearby, maybe San Francisco. You'll see San Francisco here, tap on it, and if I want the entire city, it will auto sort of show me what it will download, or we could zoom out or zoom in further. Then it will actually show us how much storage space it will take up. So once you have that, you can use maps without actually using the data or anything else. It will save you data. It will need your location to determine where you are on that map, but otherwise it will save you some power from downloading the map in real time over and over. One setting I get asked about all of the time is if you should use auto brightness. And according to Apple, absolutely you should 99% of the time. And the reason for that is you want to make sure that you're using auto brightness along with the control center at the same time. You can use both together regularly. Now, you may not want it on all the time just because you think you can manage it better, but it's actually using the ambient light sensor to always bring the brightness down to save you power when you're not using it. So typically you want to go into your settings, go to accessibility, display and text size, and enable this. I only turn it off while I'm recording a video so it doesn't change my display brightness. But when it is on, you can adjust this just the same. So maybe you're outside, it's going full brightness. You don't need it full brightness because you want to save some power. Just pull it down and it will stay there pretty much until you lock your phone again. Then you can adjust it as needed. If you're inside, the same is true. If you need to bring it down in a dark environment, it's too bright, you can do that and it will stay there until you lock your phone. Typically, it will manage it better than you can and more than you can. It will manage it in real time using those sensors. So usually you want to leave it on unless you're in a situation where it's always dark and you never want it to bring that screen brightness up. You don't really want to turn that on. And that's why Apple sort of buried the setting to make it less appealing to change. Now, the other thing you may want to consider is using dark mode. This is more on OLED displays, which is pretty much everything iOS 17 supports with the exception of iPhone SE. But with dark mode, you will save some power, but only on really dark apps and dark wallpaper. So in the areas that it's actually black on an OLED display, it turns off the pixels to make it completely black. If an app is actually gray, it's still keeping those pixels on. So dark mode will save you a little bit of power, specifically if you're using very dark wallpapers and apps that are completely black. But for the most part, in things like settings, where some of the settings are slightly gray, those pixels are on, the pixels around it are off. So it will save you some, and it will save just a little bit more. Most people like dark mode anyway, so they leave it on. One thing Apple highly recommends you turn off to save battery is your background app activity. If you go into your settings and then go to background app refresh, I typically turn this off so that it doesn't use any. So if we turn that off, now it's not going to use any of those in the background and reload things that I use regularly. I typically recommend turning them off for most things unless you need them on for something that requires real-time background app activity. Some car keys do, such as Tesla. Some things like Uber might when it's actually tracking where your order is or where the person is that's picking you up. Certain apps require it, but most of the time you can get away with just disabling it and leaving it alone. Now, we all love to change our wallpaper from time to time, and Apple added some new live wallpaper and more animated wallpaper with iOS 17. If we go over and add one, you'll see the option for live wallpaper, or if we go to astronomy, they animate and more. I would recommend not using those if you want to save the most amount of power so it doesn't have to actually turn on the GPU for those movements every time. Now, I'm not sure how much this would actually save in general. It's hard to measure, but if you want to squeak out every last bit, you may want to think about not using live wallpaper and just using regular wallpaper when you're using this regularly. Otherwise, you could just leave those on and it won't use a ton of power. Same is true with shuffling photos. If you leave that off, it's not going to have to pull from that every time and switch it. It may be very minuscule that it's saving you power, but it should save you a little bit. And to go along with wallpaper is your home and lock screen notifications. Notifications can use a lot of power. In fact, if we go into settings and we go back to my battery, you'll probably see that while I'm using this, depending on the day, my home and lock screen use a significant amount of power. And the reason for that is it may light up the screen every time you get a new notification. So you really want to customize this completely to optimize your battery. Go into your settings and then notification, and not only can you choose the type of displayed notifications, stack, list, or count, you actually have the option to switch it to a scheduled summary, which I would highly recommend. This way, it only lets you know about it when they actually come in and a little bit later, unless they're critical. So you'll see you can pick maybe some apps for the summary. So if I don't want to see something right away, but others I do, we can go through and customize this one by one. For example, I don't need to know about new podcasts right away, or maybe something from a game, but I do need to know for FaceTime if someone's calling me, so I'll leave that on. The same is true with other apps. Maybe I want to know about email, but not necessarily things from my lights or different social media apps. Customize this based on what works best for you, but that way it won't light up your display. It will just let you know later on during your scheduled summary, in the morning, evening, or whenever you have that turned on. Also, to go along with notifications, you want to go through each app and enable these accordingly. This can be a bit tedious, but I recommend doing that is maybe you want something from the Apple Store and you want time-sensitive notifications, or you don't. If you don't care about that, just turn it off completely and it will let you know later on, or you can check your email for that. So again, go through and customize this based on what matters most to you, as this really can save you a lot of power if it's not popping onto your display over and over. The same is true with mail, based on how often it actually retrieves that email. So if it's retrieving mail every 15 minutes or you've got push mail on, it's going to use more power than if you set it to manually. If you go down to your settings, go into mail, and then we go under accounts. Within accounts, you'll see that it says fetch new data. Under here, I have it set to push, but ideally you want it manually to save the most amount of power, or optimize it based on what you care about most. I typically leave it at every 15 minutes, but automatically will handle it as best it can, but it can use a lot more power. So if you turn off push notifications and have everything set to fetch or whatever you want, we'll have this one set to fetch. We'll change this one from push to fetch, and now we'll save a bunch of power. So I recommend doing that, as mail can use quite a bit of power if it's checking regularly. Also, if you have a newer iPhone that uses always-on displays, those can also light up the display with new notifications, whether that's from mail or just anything else. So you may want to consider turning that off. Many people have tested this and found that it does use some power, but not a ton, up to maybe 10%, depending on how often you're actually in always on display, how bright it is, and more. But you can disable that or customize that by going to display and brightness. Under display and brightness, go down to always on display. Under this, you have an option to customize it to just show your wallpaper, show notifications, or just turn it off altogether. I actually like it on, but I don't have it show my wallpaper. I just want the time and date rather than my wallpaper and everything else. I think that just lets me know my display is off and it gives me minimal information. You can again customize that as needed. One of the reasons the iPhone 15 Plus can get more battery life in certain situations than the 15 Pro Max is the lack of ProMotion display. While this is controversial, it does use less power. It's not using 120 Hz to smooth out the display with its refresh rate. And if you're actually going from a Pro Max to one that doesn't have it, such as a Plus, you definitely can notice it. However, if you want that extra battery life, you can actually disable it. To do that, go into your settings, go down to accessibility. Under accessibility, go down to motion. Under motion, scroll down and you'll see it says limit frame rate. If you enable this, it says sets the maximum frame rate of the display to 60 frames per second. So again, that will slow it down as far as the smoothness, but if you don't care about that, you'll really optimize your battery. Now, the next tip is seemingly counterintuitive from what you would think. What I mean by that is closing apps. Many people think that you need to close your apps when you're done with them. However, Apple and even Google on Android say that that's actually wasting your battery and that it will reload everything when you turn on that app again or boot that app back up. So if I close out music and then I go back in, it actually has to reload everything most of the time. It's not left in RAM. However, if you just leave it in the background and don't close your apps, you'll actually save some power in the long run. This has been proven time and time again and is recommended by Apple. And again, like I said, Android as well, because it seems to use less power because it doesn't need to reload everything over and over. Of course, you can close them out if you're having problems, but that's why you'll never see, most likely, a button to actually close all apps, because it's actually not something you should be doing. So just a little recommendation there from Apple on that. Now, when it comes to networking on your phone, there's some things you can change to use less power. The first thing is Bluetooth. Bluetooth uses the least amount of power, typically, of most of the wireless networks. However, if you have a ton of Bluetooth devices and you go under settings, go down to Bluetooth, you'll see I have a ton of different things here. If you don't want those to access Bluetooth, or maybe you have a car that you never want to access Bluetooth, but others you do, you may want to go into that and disable maybe certain features for that. So you don't want to sync your contacts, that will save some power. Or maybe you just don't want it to access Bluetooth altogether. Go into that, forget the device. Then it won't be looking for it. So that's something I would recommend leaving on, as it typically uses very little power, especially if you're using AirPods or something like that. If you're not, well, then you can disable it, but it uses very little power, but it's required for things such as the Apple Watch and more. Wi-Fi uses less power than cellular does, and that's something that you want to leave on regularly if you're actually at your home or maybe a business that has Wi-Fi that you use. It uses less power than LTE or 5G, and so you want to leave that on, but you may want to turn off one of the settings so it actually is looking for new Wi-Fi networks all the time. And if we go into Wi-Fi, I turn off Ask to Join Networks. Not only does that sometimes annoy you when it's popping up on your screen asking you to join a nearby network, but it also can be looking for other networks all of the time. So I turn that off so it never does that. It's not going to use additional power. When it comes to your cellular networks, those can use a lot of power, especially if you're in an area with poor signal, that will use more power, or if you're in an area where you have very low coverage. Depending on where you're at, you may want to consider just turning on airplane mode altogether or customizing it based on what you have available nearby. For example, if you don't have 5G where you live, turn that off. You can do that in settings, go up to cellular, and within your cellular data options, go under voice and data, and here you can change it to just use LTE if you don't have any 5G nearby, or you can use 5G standalone if that's available. So depending on what you have in your area, I enable or disable this depending on what I have. So based on that, I would recommend just customizing it based on what you have, where you're at. So if you don't have 5G, switch it to LTE, you'll use less power. In general, LTE does use less power, but it seems like 5G modems are getting more and more efficient. I haven't really seen many complaints about that lately. Also, low power mode is something many people use, but I wouldn't recommend using it unless you're really low on battery and can't get to a charger. That's sort of its use case. When you're down to maybe 20% power, it's going to be a while before you can get to a charger. I wouldn't enable it otherwise. The reason for that is it reduces overall brightness, it optimizes the device performance by sometimes slowing down the processor, it minimizes overall animations, turning off things such as ProMotion on the Pro displays. It even stops things from downloading in the background, from getting notifications, syncing iCloud, continuity, AirDrop, and much more. It turns off all of the features that make iPhone great. Again, I wouldn't really recommend using that unless you absolutely have to, because it changes the experience of the phone, but it's definitely available, and if you need to get that extra power, that's what it's there for. So if you're using it throughout the day, you don't want anyone to notify you, you can just throw it into low power mode. And lastly, I would recommend enabling focus modes depending on what you're doing throughout the day. For example, while I'm recording this video, I'm in Do Not Disturb, and I'm not seeing any notifications so that it's not lighting up my display, it's not doing anything else. You can customize those entirely based on what works for you by going into your focus modes and maybe customizing it while you're driving, you're at home for the evening. So if we go into home evening, it will only allow certain people and certain apps, and then it will only allow certain notifications. So those are things you can fully customize that will really help optimize battery in the long run. So I know there's a lot to go over that you can optimize battery for, especially with iOS 17. There's some things you can enable or customize. Hopefully that helps you get the most out of your battery. If there's any other tips you have, though, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. I have heard quite a few other things. The ones I mentioned are basically what Apple says uses less power. There are some other suggestions, but I haven't seen them make any significant difference. But again, let me know your favorite battery tip in the comments below, and I'll link this wallpaper in the description like I normally do. If you haven't subscribed already, though, please subscribe, and if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. As always, thanks for watching. This is Aaron. I'll see you next time.